Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host Vikas Swarup. This is our first episode of 2022, and in a first, my guests and I are all going to be conversing through the virtual medium, thanks to the wonder of technology. The new year opened with a joint statement by China, Britain, France, Russia, and the United States on January 3 to work together toward a world without nuclear weapons. These 5 countries are nuclear weapon states as defined by the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They are also the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, known as the P5 or the N5. The joint statement said that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The 5 countries also affirmed that nuclear weapons, for as long as they continue to exist, should serve defensive purposes, deter aggression, and prevent war. This spark of unity amongst the P5 came at a time when tensions between Russia and the US have reached heights rarely seen since the Cold War over a troop buildup by Russia close to the Ukrainian border. Friction between China and the United States is also rising amidst increased Chinese military activity around Taiwan. The statement also comes as the world powers seek to reach agreement with Iran on reviving the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action from which the US had withdrawn in 2018. To examine the joint statement and nuclear-related issues in general, I am joined by 2 outstanding experts. Ambassador Rakesh Sood has over 38 years of experience in the field of foreign affairs, economic diplomacy, and international security issues. He set up the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division in the Ministry of External Affairs and was India's first permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament at the United Nations in Geneva, besides serving as India's ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France. Dr. Manpreet Sethi is a distinguished fellow and head of the Nuclear Security Project at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. She is an expert on a range of nuclear issues, having published over 80 papers in academic journals of repute over the last 25 years. A very happy new year and a very warm welcome to both my panelists. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Sood. You have seen the statement put out by the P5. What prompted this show of unity between the 5 nuclear powers, which are otherwise at loggerheads on most international issues?
First of all, thank you, Vikas, for inviting me, and let me also wish you and Manpreet and the viewers a very happy new year. To answer your question, I would say that this is a momentary show of unity. My guess is that this statement was prepared in advance because the NPT review conference was actually scheduled to begin on 4th of January in New York. And, and the conference had been postponed a number of times. It was originally supposed to be held in 2020, then got postponed to 2021, then got postponed to 4th of January 2022, and now just recently has been postponed yet again. So my guess is that this momentary show of unity had been in the making as a kind of curtain raiser for the NPT review conference, because as you very accurately said, the 5 nuclear weapon states, N5, also happen to be the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, namely the P5. However, there are major doctrinal differences between US and Russia and US and China. In fact, just the following day, on 4th of January, Xi Jinping, in his capacity as chairman of the China's Central Military Commission, issued the annual mobilization order for the Chinese army, which talks of preparations for multidimensional conflict. And less than 2 weeks ago, Russia had put forward proposals of how to restore balance. Both, it put forward two proposals. One was for Russia, NATO, and the other was for US, Russia. And as we know, talks between the deputy minister level between Russia and the US are scheduled to take place in Geneva. All three countries are engaged in a massive nuclear modernization program. They have been testing hypersonics, missile defenses, and so on. So I would say that this show of unity was prompted more in their role as NPT members, N5 and P5 being identical, and was probably a momentary show.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. Dr. Sethi, as Ambassador Sood mentioned, the trigger for the P5 statement was the NPT Review Conference. Now, the NPT was a Cold War era instrument that represented a bargain between states without nuclear weapons who pledged not to acquire them, and the 5 nuclear armed states which promised to disarm, as explicitly mentioned in Article 6 of the NPT. So take us through the origins of the NPT and why India refused to sign it.
Thank you so much for having me as part of this program, and great to be with Ambassador Rakesh Sood, as my co-panelist. Now, the NPT was negotiated in the mid-1960s. In fact, it was the 18-nation Disarmament Committee that set the ball rolling on this in 1964. And between 64 and 68, the negotiations went on. The trigger for the NPT was essentially the nuclear test that had been conducted by China in 1964. And the feeling then in the US and the USSR was that more countries could move towards nuclear weapons technology. So in order to check that from happening, the idea of the Non-Proliferation Treaty was floated, negotiated, and the treaty was put out for signature from 1970 onwards. So actually in 2022, the treaty has completed 52 years of its existence, and the NPT Review Conference, which was going to take place in 2020, would have marked 50 years and was seen as a historic event that was going to take place. Unfortunately, COVID has not allowed that to happen till today. I think what made the NPT conclusion possible in 1970 was essentially a sense of convergence of interest between the US and USSR. Both were desirous of the fact that more countries must not acquire nuclear weapons. And at that moment in time, there were several countries which were known as the threshold nuclear states who could move towards nuclear weapons. So in order to arrest that trend, the treaty was negotiated. Interestingly, India was party to the negotiations. When the treaty negotiations were happening, India was very much there. The desire for India was that this would become a means to an end, the end being disarmament, that you would get the non-nuclear weapon states to remain non-nuclear and get the nuclear weapon states to move towards disarmament. And India was hoping that its national security concern, which was arising from China's nuclear test, would be addressed through this international mechanism. Unfortunately, the manner in which the treaty developed, and as you said, it led to these two categories of states, the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, with different responsibilities and different privileges, which became available to the nuclear weapon states. Also, the treaty very arbitrarily defined the date for a country to become nuclear weapon state as the 1st of January 1967. So if you had not tested by then, you were going to be a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT. So with this kind of a configuration coming into play, India decided that the NPT was not going to be in its national interest. And that's the reason we decided then to stay out of the NPT, and we've remained there.
The P5 statement says that they are committed to strengthening each of the NPT's mutually reinforcing pillars: disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. What has been the track record of the N5 with regard to each of these three pillars?
Because the P5 statement says that they are mutually reinforcing pillars. But actually, as Manpreet pointed out, when it was being negotiated in the 1960s, the primary focus was non-proliferation. And that was the basic driver that brought about a convergence between the United States and USSR, the Soviet Union, even though these two countries were rivals in the Cold War. It was a bipolar world. But on this issue, they saw eye to eye. Now, in order to make the treaty more acceptable, they also had to say that those countries that gave up their right for nuclear weapons should not be deprived of the peaceful uses, civilian applications of nuclear science and technology. And that was the international cooperation idea that was promoted. And the second thing was the idea that the nuclear weapon states would undertake negotiations with a view to getting rid of their nuclear weapons. So these were the disarmament, non-proliferation, and international cooperation for peaceful applications were the three pillars. But the three pillars were never equal pillars. In fact, I use the analogy that it was always an unbalanced three-legged stool. And that is why, even when it was concluded in 1968 and entered into force in 1970, the original period of the NPT was 25 years. That is in 1995. The 25 years were over. It is actually the 1995 conference that then extended the NPT into a permanent treaty with an indefinite and unconditional extension. Now, remember 1995, it was very much a unipolar moment. It was the US was the sole superpower, and that is how it was pushed through. But that's a separate story. But to come back to how have these three pillars been implemented, the fact remains that in the 50 plus years of the NPT's existence, no talks have ever taken place in the NPT framework for any nuclear disarmament. None whatsoever, not even once. Second, the peaceful applications of nuclear power, nuclear science and technology, somehow or the other has kind of the attraction has waned somewhat, particularly with regard to nuclear power because of difficulties about radioactive waste management and incidents like Fukushima,
Yes.
Chernobyl, and the 3 Mile Island. Then more so, therefore, the focus has become increasingly non-proliferation. And after the end of the Cold War, we saw more movement in this regard when the IAEA concluded an additional protocol for tightening the non-proliferation commitments of the NPT states parties. The coming in post 9/11 and the fact that non-state actors could also acquire weapons of mass destruction, including possibly nuclear weapons, became yet another focus, and therefore again further tightened the attempts on the non-proliferation front. And as I mentioned earlier, right now we see US, China, and Russia engaged in a renewed nuclear arms race, as it were. So disarmament, I'm afraid, seems to have receded. It is now exclusively a non-proliferation agreement.
Right. Dr. Sethi, earlier in 2021, Russia and the United States agreed to extend the New START arms control treaty for 5 years. But China, despite the dramatic buildup of its nuclear arsenal, continues to resist discussing nuclear risk reduction bilaterally with the United States. How do you see China's approach?
So I would say China has a very intelligent approach to how it's dealing with its nuclear issue. It tested in 1964, as we said earlier, and I'd say till about 2014, it maintained a rather low profile of its nuclear weapons capability. So one did not hear much about it. They maintained an opacity on the whole subject. And the focus was not so much on increase in nuclear numbers. In fact, the US kept on making these, their projections that the numbers are going to increase very rapidly in the case of China's arsenal. But we did not see that happen. Those, projections were belied by the Chinese behavior. I found the focus was essentially on their delivery capability, not so much on the nuclear warhead numbers. So essentially the ranges of the missiles, the reliability, the accuracy, the survivability by making them mobile, the penetrability to make sure that if the US was going to set up a missile defense, the Chinese missiles would still be able to penetrate that missile defense and make a difference. But with the growing confidence in their capability and with the personality of Xi Jinping, the approach of China has today changed. They now have moved on from opacity to what we now call a relative transparency. So they show you what they want to be seen in terms of the capability. And I would say there are three reasons for doing this. One is to enhance deterrence. They understand that the US has a strong nuclear, but also a very strong conventional capability. And the fear then in China is that through conventional strikes, which would be with accurate missiles, China's small nuclear arsenal could be decimated. And whatever is left will then be taken care of by the US missile defense. So then China wants to expand that capability to make sure that it will be able to carry out massive retaliation or unacceptable damage if there was ever going to be nuclear war fighting between US and China. Secondly, I think China, today's China, is very interested in asserting itself as a great global power. And for that, they want to, they themselves said, beat the US on every parameter. So whether it's the economy, whether it's, military capability, whether it's outreach to more and more countries and having engagement with them, or whether it's nuclear capability, the idea then is we have to match the US and even surpass where possible. And I see the increase in their nuclear numbers, both warhead and delivery today in that dimension. And thirdly, I think China is also building leverages for any bargaining that might be necessary if it was to be party to any arms control or nuclear risk reduction with the US. And the US is very keen. Russia itself has said that for any arms control in the future, China will also have to come into the picture. And if that is going to happen, then China is building up some leverages that it could give away in exchange for whatever arms control then becomes possible.
Ambassador Sood, 2 years ago, the US withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces or INF treaty with Russia. A positive development has been the extension of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the New START. Both sides are calling the process a strategic stability dialogue. How do you see the prospects of both countries reaching accommodation on this important issue?
Because I would say that INF was not the first bilateral treaty between US and Russia that collapsed. Before that, in 2002, the US had unilaterally withdrawn from the anti-ballistic missile treaty known as the ABM treaty.
Yes.
2 years ago, there was yet another treaty called the Open Skies Treaty. And the US withdrew from that unilaterally in 2020. And finally, the Russians said that if the US is not a party, then we are also withdrawing from it. And they withdrew from it a year later in 2021. So what we are seeing is overall a kind of a collapse of the arms control model that existed during the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was a bipolar structure. It was US and Soviet Union. And so when the Cold War ended and the world started moving, and particularly for a little while, this was a unipolar movement, but today, increasingly, we are seeing an emergence of a multipolar world, which means that global power equations have changed. Now, arms control is not an end in itself. Arms control is a means towards strategic stability. So obviously, if you have shifted from a bipolar order to a multipolar order, your strategic stability equations also have to be redone. And I think today's challenge is essentially how do we redefine strategic stability in a multipolar order? Now, you can have sets of bilateral discussions. You can have US Russia, you can have US China, you can have India China, and so on. But ultimately, all the players, all the poles have to also agree on a bare minimum. And therein lies the challenge. So there has to be a beginning, because certainly US and Russia have the largest nuclear weapon stockpiles. More than 90% of global stockpiles are with US and Russia. But at the same time, it is not enough to get global strategic stability, because we need to redefine that term in a multipolar world.
Dr. Sethi, in January last year, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, also known as the Nuke Ban Treaty, came into force. It is a legally binding instrument aimed at total elimination of nuclear weapons under the aegis of the United Nations. India is unique in its commitment to the goal of a nuclear weapon-free world, despite being a de facto nuclear weapon power. Yet, the nuclear powers, including India, did not participate in the negotiations on the TPNW. What was the reason?
So I think India supports the objective of the TPNW. India does want a nuclear weapons-free world because it believes that it's in its national security to have a world without nuclear weapons. But India does not believe that an instrument like the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons can be the best way to get to a nuclear weapons-free world. And that's the reason that India refrained. And let me just try and explain very briefly what were the reasons why India felt TPNW was not the right instrument. Firstly, the manner in which it was negotiated, the treaty was negotiated. India has always believed that on an issue like this, consensus is very important. Because as you said, the nuclear weapon states stayed out of the negotiations because they did not expect that this would be the way to get to a nuclear weapons-free world. India has always maintained that to get to disarmament, we first need to reduce the salience of the nuclear weapon, to make it valueless, because it's human nature. When you attach value to something, you get attached to that commodity. So in the case of nuclear weapons, India's approach is that we must have consensus on reducing the importance of nuclear weapons in national security strategies. And I think India's own doctrine, explains this very well by suggesting that you have less numbers and you have constrained circumstances in which you will use that weapon, which in the case of India is nuclear deterrence and no first use, that we will not be the first to use nuclear weapons. So you're constraining the role of the weapon. And that's the way to get to disarmament. Since the TPNW was negotiated at the United Nations General Assembly, which takes a majority vote, and obviously the non-nuclear weapon states are just too many. So the majority carried the TPNW through. But the nuclear weapon states never had their heart in this because there are other steps that are necessary to get them to reduce the value. So India's belief was that the manner in which it was negotiated, without trying to achieve consensus on reducing the role, was not the right way to get to a nuclear weapons-free world. Secondly, the TPNW never provided for any verification. So it did not even define some of the terminologies. So it said, you're welcome to join the TPNW by destroying your nuclear arsenal. But what does destruction mean? Does it mean just demating the missiles from the weapons and keeping the warheads in a certain kind of a hedge stock? Who is going to monitor that you are actually destroying the arsenal? What are going to be the enforcement mechanisms for this? So all of this was never spelled out in the treaty. And these are going to be very important issues when one gets to a nuclear weapons-free world. Lastly, I think what also India felt was that since these legitimate issues on disarmament were not tackled properly, it did participate in several other mechanisms, like the governmental group of experts on nuclear disarmament verification, so that one would arrive at a confidence of verification of destruction of arsenals before you start thinking about how it's going to happen. So TPNW was not seen as the right instrument. Even though the numbers of ratifications are growing, we've seen they're only the non-nuclear weapon states So the treaty seems to have banned the weapon for countries that don't have the weapon at this
Correct.
moment, while the nuclear weapon states have still stayed out of it.
Ambassador Sood, India has been a very responsible nuclear weapon state. How do you see India's own approach to disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses of nuclear energy?
India is a kind of a sui generis country in this regard. And this is true right from 1947 onwards when India became independent. In this, we have to understand that our first Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, he was passionately committed to developing a scientific, technological temperament and using science and technology for economic development and for benefiting the people. Now, in that, he was assisted by some very visionary scientists. In the nuclear domain, everybody knows it was Dr. Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha was a very well-known, he was probably among the youngest fellow of Royal Society physicists at that time. And he came back to set up the Department of Atomic Energy. The first Atomic Energy Act was adopted in 1948 itself. Imagine in 1948, we had so many other challenges. There was a war with Pakistan that was taking place over Jammu and Kashmir. We were in the middle of drafting our own constitution. We were coping with a massive refugee influx arising out of partition and so on. And yet in the middle of that, the Atomic Energy Act was adopted. So this indicates the kind of vision that was brought to bear. The first nuclear research reactor in Asia was set up in Trombay. The first nuclear power reactor in Asia came online, it was Tarapur in 1969. So right through, India has always been a responsible player in this. And even though we were not parties to the NPT, as we talked about earlier, in some fashion, we were more responsible, I would say, than even some of the countries that were parties to the NPT. And I think the recognition of that was the special waiver that India got in 2008 by the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So it is, as I said, to come back, India is a sui generis country.
Dr. Sethi, as Ambassador Sood mentioned, India has an impeccable record on non-proliferation. Then why are we still being denied entry into the Nuclear Suppliers Group? China has stated that non-NPT countries must have a separate admission criteria. Non-proliferation is another priority for the global nuclear order. But what would you say about China's own record vis-à-vis North Korea and Pakistan?
It's obviously China's political objections, which is not allowing India the NSG membership. If you look at the technical criteria which is necessary for being an NSG member, India fulfills all of them. And while China argues that you have to be a member of the NPT to be an NSG member, that's not what the technical criteria says. In fact, if you look at the website of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, it only says that you have to be in compliance with the principles of the NPT. And I would suggest that India is more in compliance with the principles of the NPT than China itself. As you mentioned, I mean, China's proliferation record, due to the help that it's given to North Korea and to Pakistan to make them nuclear weapon states, is very well known. It's, archival history is now available for everyone to see the kind of deception that went on and the proliferation record of China. So it's essentially China's political objections that is standing in the way. As the Sood said, the exceptionalization that India got in 2008 has solved the problem for us in a certain way. We can now import nuclear material from outside. We can get nuclear reactors from outside. We've got memorandums of understanding with as many as 14 countries on nuclear technology, equipment, and material today. The problem only lies in the fact that you would want to be a part of the rule-making body, because India has such huge ambitions on nuclear power. It is investing in a large number of nuclear reactors. You don't want it to happen that the rules are changed at any point in the future, and therefore you want to be a party to the NSG. But I don't think any of us need to lose sleep over the fact that we are not members of the NSG. That will come along in its own way. but for the time being, we have to put up with China's behavior on many, many fronts and keep our flanks covered on all of these. That's where I would say India is on the NSG right now.
With that, we have run out of time. I would like to thank both panelists for their very valuable inputs and insights. The P5 statement might be new, but as our panelists have told us, the elements it contains have been articulated by India for a very long time, be it in the area of nuclear disarmament or non-proliferation of nuclear weapons or reducing nuclear danger. So let us hope that in 2022, nuclear powers will come together to address these challenges to make the world a better and safer place. That is all I have for you tonight. Join me for a new episode of Diplomatic Dispatch next week. Till then, good evening and goodbye.